Welcome everyone to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by David N. Weinberg. David, it is great to see you again.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
David, you are a prolific writer on many issues related to Israel's security, and we're going to share some of your articles when we put out this briefing. And recently you wrote about E1 and the fight for Palestinian statehood and how that is all connected. So I'd love to explore that with you right now. Why don't we just jump in and explain to us, catch us up on this great debate about E1. What is E1 and where do you see that moving?
Thank you. Great to be with you. Moshe, this is an important issue. Building 10 to 50,000 homes in the tract of land east of Jerusalem known as E1 is critical for the future of Jerusalem and Israel's security. And it's also appropriate pushback against the arrogant Western attempt to ram runaway, perilous Palestinian statehood down Israel's throat. So, as you suggested, let's back up a little bit. E1 begins on the eastern slopes of Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives, and runs along the road towards Ma'ale Adumim. And from Ma'ale Adumim, the main road highway number 1, runs down to the Jordan Valley. It's the last piece of significant unsettled land in the Jerusalem envelope. It's the only place where tens of thousands of homes can be built to overcome Jerusalem's serious housing shortage. So first of all, E1 is a municipal issue. And the city has been held hostage to global politics. There's been no significant building underway in Jerusalem, in the greater Jerusalem envelope, for more than 2 decades. Going back to Prime Minister Netanyahu's first term in office in the late 90s, where he built the Har Choma neighborhood in southern Jerusalem. Since then, everything has been deferred. So that's one. Second of all, there's a Zionist mission involved here, which is keeping Jerusalem Jewish and Zionist. Hardworking, upwardly mobile young families with kids simply have no affordable options in Jerusalem. And that demographic has been leaving the city, leaving Jerusalem with socio-economically poor populations, mainly Arab and ultra-Orthodox residents. And this has grim implications for the attachment of Israeli society to Jerusalem. Third of all, this is a military issue. As I mentioned before, Highway 1, which runs up from Tel Aviv and down to Jerusalem and then all the way down to the Jordan Valley, is the only west-east access across Israel with a Jewish population majority. It's the only safe route through which Israel can mobilize troops down from the coast to the Jordan Valley in case of a military emergency, and therefore Israel needs to secure this corridor. Fourth of all, it's a strategic issue because E1 leads to the Jordan Rift Valley, which is Israel's irreplaceable defensive eastern border. It's the zone that protects Israel from invasion from the east. And we know that Iran is actively trying to destabilize Jordan and turn the Jordan River into Israel's hottest and most porous border. Already now, Iranian weapons and large quantities of drugs, unfortunately, flow into Judea and Samaria across this confrontation line, which is why Israel is now building a more than 5 billion shekel, that's $1.5 billion, security barrier along the Jordan Valley. And therefore, defensible borders are critical to Israel. They're markers that ensure Israel's security needs. The Jordan Valley is critical to that. And they guarantee that any future peace treaties, should we merit one, will be sustainable. And therefore, E1 is a critical element in, as I said, both strengthening Jerusalem and Israeli security. And that brings us to your second issue, which is how do we push back against the drive for Palestinian statehood now?
And are you able to kind of compare or contrast the failure to build in E1 versus building in other areas, which are Area C, and the freedom of operation that Israel has had in expanding, let's say, areas around Modi'in, right? I think Nofi alone is like almost on the border of the Green Line, or even north of Jerusalem, where Ramallah creeps into Area C. So all of that gets built, and then E1 has been stagnant forever.
You're right. And every Israeli prime minister since Yitzhak Rabin, preceding Oslo, has planned and promised to build an E1 for the salient reasons I mentioned earlier. And as you noted, Jerusalem already abuts Ramallah in the north and Bethlehem in the south. Israel can't really build towards the west because that's the green areas, what's known as the green lung of Jerusalem, and all the environmental groups have blocked plans to build, out past Hadassah and the eastern edge of Jerusalem. So building westwards, in this case, into the Sumerian highlands on the tract of land between Jerusalem and Moed Adumim is critical.
So, right now, Marco Rubio and U.S. officials are planning a trip to Israel, and certainly this is being talked about right now. Do you see a change in this? Do you think finally, we're going to see building happening in E1?
That really depends, I think, on the stability of the current government. We all know that we're going into election season, and to an election year, there will be an Israeli election sometime between January and September of next year. My guess is in the spring. And that makes significant decision making or acting on decisions like this difficult. Let's admit a couple realities to ourselves. Most Israelis once upon a time entertained the possibility of a full-fledged Palestinian state, a democratic and demilitarized Palestinian state living in peace alongside Israel. But that's no longer the case. It's no longer the case because the slaughter of the Second Palestinian Intifada disabused most Israelis of that notion, and the Hamas October 7th assault buried it even deeper. It's no longer believable or feasible, at least not for the very, very long term. And yet, paradoxically, some in the world seem to have doubled down specifically, as we say in Hebrew, davka, at this time, on their demands for full-out Palestinian statehood. Now, in complete disregard for the plunge of Palestinian politics into annihilationist and jihadist directions, even anti-Semitic directions, and in utter disdain for Israel's nationalist and security perspectives. And as you know, they're condescendingly going to slap down Israel at the UN later this month by defiantly swearing their loyalty, their fealty to Palestinian statehood. And Israel has to rebuff this outrageous move. Building an E1, so any ways necessary for the reasons that we discussed earlier, is appropriate pushback, and it's a modest move at that. The more the world fails to advance realistic parameters for some sort of Palestinian accommodation with Israel, the less autonomy Palestinians might obtain. They need to understand that. Now, there is the beginning of discussion in government circles here of going beyond E1 and applying Israeli sovereignty, extending Israel's jurisdiction to broader areas of Judea and Samaria, such as the Jordan Valley, such as the broader Jerusalem envelope, which would include not only Ma'ale Adumim, but also Gush Etzion, such as extending Israeli sovereignty to major parts of Area C, which is where all Israeli towns in Judea and Samaria are located. Now, the Europeans argue that this will bifurcate the contiguous tracts of land that they hope to grant to a Palestinian state in the future. And I think that's a red herring. The demand for territorial contiguity is insurmountable. That's not the reality in Judea and Samaria. Any arrangements in the future will involve two populations, Jewish and Arab, that are enmeshed with roads and blocks and bypasses and overpasses and underpasses and detour roads. That's the reality in Judea and Samaria. So instead of battering Israel, the West should be advancing realistic space sharing arrangements, and there are multiple ways of fashioning that. Aside from the fact that they ought to treat Palestinians as responsible adults with no free pass as to the type of autonomous self-rule they might establish. And that, of course, opens up a whole another conversation about the lack of rule of law, peace education, and so on in Palestinian areas. So in the meantime, Israel will assertively build E1, develop E1 to strengthen Jerusalem and secure the Jewish nation state.
And if we can just focus on the geography for just a second, the argument historically not to build an E1 is because it precludes a future Palestinian state from having this connection between the Shomron, the Samaria area, and the Judea area. If you build an E1, you can't build a contiguous Palestinian state. So let me just ask two quick questions. First of all, if there was complete building within E1, they could build a bypass road, to somehow loop around Yericho, which obviously would require more travel, but it is doable. And second of all, Gaza is already isolated geographically. So once Gaza is isolated from Judea and Samaria, what's the big deal if Gaza is isolated, Judea is isolated, and the Shomron would be isolated in that future state? Why does that not work geographically?
Okay, so we need to distinguish here between two terms. One that I mentioned earlier is territorial contiguity, which is a principle that the Palestinians and their European backers insist on, which frankly is impossible and insurmountable in the reality of Judea and Samaria that we have today. The alternative term is transportation contiguity, where, as I mentioned earlier and you suggested now, a series of roads, bypasses, detours, and so on can be crafted that would allow travel from one area of Palestinian autonomous rule to another, from Ramallah to Bethlehem, through, underneath, and around the Jerusalem E1 Ma'ale Adumim block that we talked about earlier. If people are seriously looking for realistic accommodation, that's the direction things will need to move. But if the world ties itself to what is today a stale concept, full-fledged Palestinian sovereignty, statehood, on all the land that the Arab world, Jordan and Egypt, held before June 1967 and the Six-Day War, and anything else isn't acceptable, then we're at an impasse, because that's not something that's acceptable to the public in Israel any longer, for good reasons.
And ironically, if a bypass road were built from Ramallah to Beit Lechem, they'd have less traffic than having to battle the traffic going into and out of Jerusalem. It would be in their best interests.
Yeah. I happened to have been in Mishar Adumim and Ma'ale Adumim yesterday for a for a azkara, a yortzeit. And sure enough, we battled the traffic, particularly into Jerusalem later in the evening. Road development for Jews and Arabs in Judea and Samaria is still lagging 2 decades behind where it should be, although there have been improvements.
Okay, so the world is holding on to this concept of a two-state solution since 1947 and prior, and it just is not working. What is an alternative?
First of all, I think the path to a different understanding, to a different paradigm for Israeli-Palestinian futures starts with the recognition that there never will be a Palestinian state. Many people, find that statement outrageous, if not a war crime. But that's the reality. I'll point listeners and our viewers to a very important article that was published day before yesterday in a publication known as Mosaic Magazine. It's online. It's an article by Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams was senior Republican administration Middle East national security official. Today he's at the Council of Foreign Relations, and he wrote an article, Why There Will Never Be a Palestinian State. And the problem is that Palestinian nationalism is fundamentally about destroying the Jewish state, not about establishing a Palestinian one. State building is not a Palestinian priority, apparently, and the absence of such a state is not the cause of the conflict. He points to two prominent American and American Arab officials who served in democratic administrations, including during the Obama and Biden administrations, who've just recently written a book about decades of effort to establish Palestinian statehood. This is Rob Malley, and Hussein Agra. And they admit that there's no denying the fact that the vast majority of Palestinians have embraced and celebrated the October 7th assault because it speaks to their most profound feelings. October 7th wasn't just Hamas. It was Palestinian to the core. Will Palestinian society ever abandon its support for violence and terrorism? That's the question now. You mentioned Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, who's arriving here next week or the week after, before Rosh Hashanah. Among other, he's coming to participate in an important inauguration ceremony in Ir David, the city of David, in Jerusalem, where they'll be opening something known as the they call it the Valley or the Pathway of the Pilgrims, which is an incredible underground access route dating to Temple times. It's a major project. The fact that the U.S. Secretary of State is going to the city of David to reinforce the current American administration's recognition of the historic roots of the Jewish people in Jerusalem and in Zion is extremely important. That is pushback against the impossible demand for full-fledged Palestinian statehood, and he's sort of added to that by denying Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas and about 80 of his Palestinian diplomats access to the UN for the UN General Assembly later this month, where President Macron of France and the Prime Minister of England, the Prime Minister of Canada, and others are preparing to grandstand at Israel's expense and recognize Palestinian statehood. This is very important. The world has to hold Palestinians accountable, and to refuse to participate in the UN and other international charades where Abbas pretends to be the leader of an existent state. The only practical impact of that is that it encourages Hamas and the Palestinian Authority to continue fighting Israel forever.
David, there's been a lot of talk about the Emirates plan. Do you see any hope that that can work, or at the end of the day, there is this national ideology built on the destruction of Israel, and therefore reorganizing is not going to change that on a kind of an educational and national values level?
So I think that encouraging pockets of Palestinian autonomy where there are leaders who are willing to break away from the Hamas Fatah ideology, which calls for Israel's destruction, where there are leaders who are prepared to invest in good governments and compromise with Israel, Israel should encourage that. At the same time, I have doubts about the so-called plan for a dozen Palestinian emirates in Judea and Samaria. I don't want 10 or 12 Palestinian mini armies running around in Judea and Samaria. An emirate, first and foremost, would mean the use of force, or the legitimate use of force, to control things in each semi-autonomous area. I'm not sure that's a workable solution for Israel. I understand the logic behind it, which is that Palestinian clans are the real source of authority in Palestinian society. And I mean, there's one clan that more or less holds Hebron. There's another clan in Nablus. They're very different one from the other. And were there Palestinian leaders to emerge in these areas that are prepared to cooperate with Israel and fight terrorism against Israel and invest money in developing the quality of life for their residents and developing their town, not spending it all, to pay salaries for terrorists, that would be a good thing. But I'm not sure we're ever going to see, or that it's necessarily the right way to go, to establish a dozen Palestinian emirates in the territories. This, of course, is a plan you're referring to that was hatched by Dr. Mordechai Kedar about a decade ago, and has had somewhat of a renaissance in recent times, because there was one clan in the Hebron area that spoke up and said, we'd be willing to move in better directions.
So a two-state solution has never worked. You are skeptical that the clans can work. What is the future then? Are we going about this all the wrong way, trying to find a solution to a problem? Maybe there's a completely different approach. What do you think?
So your question is a good question, and not only do I not have a clear answer for you, I don't have to give a clear answer. You can't plan out everything in the future. You can look at trends in diplomacy, in statecraft, in strategy, military realities, and security, and you can aim in a certain direction without necessarily knowing how things will develop. Everything is dependent on maturity in the Palestinian community. Now, October 7th set everything back decades. We know how popular Hamas's assault on Israel was and remains in Palestinian society. We know that if elections were held in Judea and Samaria today for some sort of Palestinian autonomous leadership, Hamas would win outright. And therefore, for me to paskin, for us to decide now what it is that will define Israeli-Palestinian division of sovereignty and power in Judea and Samaria looking ahead 20 years is close to impossible. What we do need to do, as I mentioned earlier, is encourage realistic processes of accommodation, not to feed Palestinian fantasies of victory over Israel.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing all of this. I want to go off topic if I can. You wrote a recent article, and I'm gonna share the links to your articles because they're really fantastic, on the snapback mechanism that is being debated right now. Can you just share one thought on that you wrote about?
Snapback, of course, is the mechanism that was built into President Obama's original nuclear accord with Iran, which allowed for the snapback, the return of massive sanctions on Iran if it doesn't live up to its commitments under the accord on the 10th anniversary of the Accords, which is October of this year. Now, the British, Germans, and French have announced that they are triggering the snapback mechanism. But I fear, and this is what I wrote about, I think they're going to yet weasel out of it. They're yet going to let Iran wiggle off the hook. They're now talking about giving Iran a 6-month extension or a 1-year extension. I would hope and assume that the U.S. administration will block any attempt to let Iran once again wiggle off the sanctions. And the Iranians are quite worried about this. These are potentially significant sanctions that would weaken an already weakened Iranian economy.
Now, the sanctions didn't work, right? Israel and the U.S. needed to strike. So is there an argument that returning the sanctions is giving a false sense of security and maybe drop the sanctions and strike sooner?
It's a good question. I think the sanctions are important. It will choke off a great deal of Iran's oil exports and its imports of critical materials for its military, for its ballistic weapons plan. Yes, it's true. The Iranians have always managed to evade some of the sanctions and use all sorts of import and export smuggling routes. And no, it does not mean that further military strikes on Iran may be necessary if they plow forward with either their ballistic missile or nuclear bomb effort. But they're nevertheless an important signal to the Iranians and a signal that the Iranians would feel in concrete terms.
David M. Weinberg, always a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.